depressed. They may be just trying to get by, and they're getting some recognition for doing that. And then lastly, I have this side effect loop that there's no failure here, but there's potential failure here. So I have this lack of failure that's coming up here that's working against me for people wanting to go against that. So this, if this was a positive reinforcing loop, here's a negative action that's working against me in this loop. So I might, one way of doing that is solve it by bypassing, hey, I'm just going to reward experiments. I'm going to recognize people for taking experiments. And that gets rid of this delay part. All right, they're getting recognized, not for the exact same thing, but they're getting a recognition. So I'm still reinforcing that recognition. And that allows people to take controlled experiments, right? So that's one thing to think about. So again, the point here is not to necessarily dive in this. Every organization, these loops might look a little different. But the thing is this is the way you want to think about taking a habit and moving it to figure out how you would change the habit into something more constructive, going in the direction you want to go. So we've got an idea of how to approach habits, and we've got all these other types of changes that we can do, structure changes, process. To get from my current state to the next state, I do have to manage it, all right? So management of that change still has to occur. So it doesn't go away. So how do I do that? Well, I inspect and adapt. That's the direction I want to do. I want to do inspection and adaptation to make sure I'm going the right direction. But there's something I need to think about a little bit in this inspect and adapt, is that there's this thing called the change curve. How many people are familiar with Virginia Satir? Anybody familiar with her? J-curve, learning curve, all sorts of stuff. I introduce a change. The first thing that happens is my performance of whatever the team is or the organization decreases. It doesn't go up immediately. It's always going to decrease a little bit. It may be very minor disruption. And then I'll peak out at some point, if it's a good change, at some new status quo. If it's a bad change, it'll be down here, and I'm going to ditch that change and go back to status quo. I'm also going to have a time of disruption. So if it's something that's really easy, my disruption may be very tiny, and it may not last long, right? I may also not get a huge increase in my new status quo, what it would be. So again, this is something to keep in mind when you're making changes, right? So that we're going to run across this change curve no matter what we do. And what's more important when we start thinking about organizational transformation is we need to make this sustainable. I'm going to be making changes constantly, right? I'm moving on a journey, and it's not a destination. So I'm never going to get there. At some point, my aspiration is probably even going to change. So I need to be able to keep this change sustainable over time. So how do we do that? Well, just quickly looking at some definitions. Sustainable means I need to be at a certain rate. A good synonym for the way we're thinking about it in this term is actually being supportable or having capacity for that change. And then, the instance of becoming different, shifting, mutating, whatever it wants to do. So I want to have change capacity. That's what I'm looking to get. So if I thought of this as a big task board, or preferably a Kanban board, I've got all this backlog of stuff that I want to change. Some of it's really large, some of it's really tiny. I can only handle so much, either because of skills I need to figure out and how to add, or mindset that I need to change, or maybe just structures that are going along that I've got to change. And I can only change so much. And whatever I can change, the deal is my organizational change capacity. So when I say I want to make an agile transformation, that's a big epic. I've got to think about breaking down the story so I can meet what my capacity of my organization is. And eventually, I'll have things that get done. And hopefully, as things get done, they actually reinforce new things that I want to introduce. And we'll talk a little bit about things that can help in that regard. Quickly visiting the curve. So if I introduce changes, let's suppose that I want to introduce two changes essentially at the same time. And they have roughly the same disruption and stuff. And give me the same status quo improvement. If I theoretically, they would drop me twice as much, take the same amount of time, but yet yield a result that's twice as good, right? So that's, in theory, that's what it'd be. Again, I have a certain amount of capacity. So how many of these I can overlap? Really, it depends on how far down I can go for a disruption as I'm doing that. So I have to think a little about it. And of course, we all know all changes are not equal. So I could have some that are more additive to the negative as well as the positive where I come out. Just give you a quick thing. I could say, well, I'm not going to do the other change until I get the other one up here at the new status quo. The problem is that my delay here may be too long. I may need it for market pressures or whatever. I may need to make the changes faster. And of course, there's all sorts of different ways I can overlap this, if I'm thinking about it. Maybe I do one, once I start coming out and I get that aha moment, okay, well, I'll pick out this next one, blah, blah, blah. So there's lots of different ways you can think about this overlap. But the point is really think a little bit about what you can afford for a lag and delay, as well as the disruption effect, because this all affects how much capacity you're going to be eating up out of your organization. So what things can we do to help promote being able to take on more? So going from my starting point to this aspiration, these are some of the things that can help me. Having transparency on how decisions are made, or cross-cutting teams for problem solving, or having and orienting employees along where our vision is, right? Those are all things that will help me expand my capacity of being able to take on more. Likewise, I have things that can restrict it. If I put people in the specialized silos, or I only reward successes, which kind of says that failures aren't tolerated, even though I, may tolerate them, but if I only ever reward successes, I'm kind of sending a message that I don't tolerate them. If I have things like where I only, hire people that think the way we currently do, I don't have any desire for diversity of opinion, then those are going to restrict my capacity for change. So those are things that I need to think a little bit about and how I approach getting the right capacity in, right? And I want to expand it as much as possible. So I'm managing the change, but I need to visualize this, right? I can't manage something I can't see, right? So I need to take a look at how well I'm doing. And I would recommend that you set up a transformation Kanban board. Probably, I don't know how many people are familiar with Kanban, but I'm going to set up these columns of things. This is just one way of looking at it. Every organization might be a little different. I do, since now we're talking about individual operational changes, I do want to consider measurements. Some of them may be fairly soft measurements, like how do you measure, people are being more collaborative, for example, if that's my concrete goal that I'm trying to do. And there are ways to do that, but some of them are really hard for measurement. So it may be more of a subjective measurement that you're trying to do, but don't be afraid of that. And so when I look at this, I need to take a look at my organizational capacity and figure out, what my WIP's going to allow me to do in taking in. Because again, backlog to done is the entire work in progress. So I need to make sure I don't take on too much. And here's some things to think about as we move in. So in order to be ready to be pulled in, I want to make sure the team that's going to do the work has the capacity to do it. Has time set aside to help. They have the right skills and so forth. They have a charter to do it, so that everybody understands the type of change they're doing. They have some measures that they're trying to get to, that they're going to measure themselves or the organization at the end, and they have some outcomes they're trying to achieve. Again, this is because this is a concrete, small change. And then once they complete it, then I want to make sure I have capacity to measure it. A lot of times people go through the transformation process and they don't really measure in the improvement that they got out of it. And finally, when I can declare I'm done once I've measured it and I know what the results are. Because this will tell me whether I actually achieved an improvement over status quo or not, right? So that's essentially what I'm trying to get there. So that's great, but how much do we figure out we want to pull? You talked about this capacity. Well, I would throw that the way of thinking about capacity is a little bit around sort of story pointing, normalized story pointing, whatever your mid-level is for your organization. And think of that around how much I can pull by paths, communications paths between people, and how many people are involved in the change. So if I've got a hierarchy, my paths are going to be pretty low, right? Everything's going to the boss. So I'm going to have a very low number, and if I've got a large number of people, I'm not going to be able to take on a lot. If I have a team, then the sum is whatever the size of the team, the sum of the numbers of however many in the team is to -1. So if it's 4, the sum is 6, for example. If it's 5, it's 10. And of course, I can have some hybrids. I may involve parts of hierarchy in an organization. I may have customer-supplier relationships that get involved. So those might add in paths and number of people being involved. After that, I'm going to think about modifiers that get introduced by team size. And lastly, I've got some reinforcing loops that can work either for or against me. And so I need to take a look at some of those factors and see if those are working for or against me and try to eliminate those ones that are working against me and get more that are working for me. So team size plays in. If I thought of Scrum teams, and this is all based on research, right? The